everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Ingmar Gorman, Ph.D. How are you today?
Doing great. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. You've been on at least a few times in the past, right?
I believe once, and it's been actually quite a long time.
Wow.
I think it was really early on. Yeah. So I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, glad to have you back. All of us have been through so much over the last many years here in psychedelia, and we've got a lot to dig into. But I guess first, to set the stage for everybody, can you give us a little bit of an idea of your background and your work in psychedelics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a psychologist, a clinical psychologist by training, and I've had an interest in psychedelic research and therapy from about 2006. And fast forward through my career, as I was finishing up my Ph.D., my internship, I had an opportunity to begin as a co-principal investigator and study therapist on the phase 2 and phase 3 studies of MAPS's, now Lykos's, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials for PTSD. And over the years, I also created a training company that focuses on training mental health professionals in psychedelic therapy, psychedelic harm reduction, preparation, and called Fluence. And we also work with drug sponsors. So right now we have about 8 different drug sponsor clients that we support in creating their psychotherapy methods, the manual, the training content, and then we train their clinicians specifically for clinical trial work to hopefully support them in having their drug that they're studying eventually approved by the FDA. And let's see, anything else I'm missing? I'm the CEO, co-founder of Fluence, and yeah, I think maybe just to say, as of late, I have been hearing a lot in the psychedelic community, and obviously also that recent decision by the FDA as it pertains to MDMA. And I guess what I could say is I think I'm finding my voice in being able to speak up against some of the things that I'm hearing that I don't think are factually correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad. It's been a dicey few years where there have been people out there that made it really unsafe for people to come forward with really important discussions like this. And it was only safe to have a certain narrow set of perspectives. And I think we're finally on the other side of that in a major way, though, I'm still getting beat up regularly. I hope I can take the brunt of it so that, smart people can actually start making a difference here.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'll say, from an outsider's perspective, who, I check in on you all fairly regularly, listen to the podcast or just keep, and I can't, if this is of any reassurance to you, I can't tell that there's anything going on from the outside perspective. And, as to what you said, I would really like to underline what we mean by, at least what I mean by safety when I hear you say that word. What that is, I think that for many of my colleagues and myself who were researchers and investigators and therapists on the clinical trials, many of us have felt afraid to speak up or share our opinions because of the concern of being kind of dragged through the mud or being shamed, particularly online. And this is a phenomenon that I think we're all experiencing in many, many different arenas, fields, just society. And it can be really scary to speak up. And I think that I do think the tide is shifting.
Yeah. And, it's not like somebody's going to come over and necessarily stab or shoot us, though I have had that fear in the past when I'm having an intersection with some of the darker aspects of this space. But it's more just public bullying. There's evidence of blackmail and extortion type stuff from some of these folks, and deliberate efforts to ruin people. So, with that, how can we, operate in good faith with those folks? And I think the answer is we cannot. And I hope we can collectively just say, okay, enough's enough. They might do it, they might not. Hopefully the steam ran out, and now we can actually come forward with some meaningful critiques of their, efforts?
Yeah, yeah. I think I think we're talking a little bit of an abstract now. I bet some of
Sure.
our listeners will know what we're talking about. Some won't. But yeah, I think it's just important for me to act as much as possible in a way where just speaking about what I see as the truth, what I see as the facts, have it backed up by sources, and hopefully kind of undermine some of the deliberate efforts to well, I don't want to say they're deliberate, but to clear up misinformation.
Yeah. So, um, where do we want to start? Do we want to start talking about the recent like AdCom and FDA decision after that, or do we want to maybe go upstream, or how are you feeling about this?
Yeah, I was wondering about this same question because there's so much to tackle. I mean, I maybe a good place to start. Sorry, I hope we don't chart. A good place to start would be to maybe just for me to share my view on what has happened over the last year. Hopefully, I don't know if you're monetized, so I hope I didn't demonetize you
You're all
all.
good. You're all good.
But I think one thing to start with is just I've really begun to make explicit that I don't believe in monocausal explanations. So, as it pertains to the FDA's decision to, at this time, not approve Lykos's and new drug application, it's not all of Lykos's fault. It's not all the FDA's fault. It's also not all Symposia's fault or ICER's fault. It's a combination of multiple events that occurred over time. And, you know, my take on this, and this is just my opinion, and I should also mention that I'm not speaking on behalf of Lykos at all, just to be very, very clear. My view is that, I think it began with, in some ways, with Rick Doblin asking for the ICER to review their data, and I don't think that's a mistake. I think that was a good call, right? To have a very critical organization examine and evaluate the efficacy and financial impact of a potential new treatment. And ICR began to do what they were asked to do. And there was a period of time where there was, I think, I guess you could say incomplete communication between Lykos and ICER. And there's a fair amount of he said one group said one thing, the other group said another thing. I don't really want to get into that. But the issue was that towards December, and this is all part of sort of public documentation the ICER released, it wasn't until December that they brought up some of the allegations against Lykos as it pertains to sort of harmful or unethical conduct. And it should be noted that the named source for that information was David Nichols and Lily Ross. This is public. It's in the information that ICER published. And this is just my opinion. I don't know what Lykos was thinking, but I imagine that they were a few weeks away from the NDA submission and the data. And I know that they were extremely cautious about making any kind of external communication about the data or what was going on. And so I believe they chose to not communicate at that point, which I think in hindsight was a mistake, but I think it's hard to fault them for making that decision at that time. And then, I've spoken to David Rinn, the CMO of ICER, several times, and I found him to be quite understanding of the situation. But my sort of critique of it is that, they wrote this section 2.1 in the ICER report that speaks to these unverified claims of unethical or problematic aspects of the studies. And this was, I think, the beginning of the real downhill trajectory for Lykos. It was the draft, and then it was the final report, and it was a legit, ICR, an organization that I believe plays an important role in evaluating novel treatments as a nonprofit, that the ICR gave legitimacy to some of the allegations that were brought up in the report. And my critique of ICER would be that, and they said this themselves, they aren't a primary research organization, right? They collect public information or information that they get from a drug sponsor, raw data, they analyze it and they come up with some sort of conclusion, but they don't do their own research. So when, identify, create new data. And so when this information was presented to them, these allegations, it's not within their capacity to validate or invalidate or investigate the truthfulness of these claims. And it's stated in the report. But when you publish something like that, and then journalists are really interested in covering it, and then you have all of the things that we saw unfold in terms of the attention that it received, well, that has an impact unto itself, even if you say like, well, we don't know if this is validated or not. The other thing that I'll just quickly mention on this topic is that, and I can't go into details, but and this is the issue with confidentiality to institutions, but there are aspects of the evidence that was submitted to the ICER by individuals who were in symposia at the time or former members of symposia that really created a negative picture of what was going on. And it was in fact not the full context. The evidence provided was, I don't whether that was intentional or unintentional. It made it look like something really nefarious was going on when it was not the case. But unfortunately, Lycos and others are not able to provide greater detail. And this is often sort of a pattern, right, where a group is beholden to institutions that they have to retain, or individuals that they have to retain confidentiality with. You can't really speak against it, against some of the allegations. Mm-hmm. I know I'm speaking here for quite a bit, but I think just to accelerate, I think the FDA AdCom was clearly influenced by the ICER report. And breaking down the AdCom is its own podcast. And I also want to say that it's not, Lycos also has made mistakes, unforced errors. There are also things that they should have done that they didn't do that we could get into. But I think the vote, 9 against 2, 12 against 1, however it was right now, that really made it very difficult for the FDA to make a decision that was contrary to that AdCom when it was such an extreme. If it was, my opinion is that if it was like 60% against 40 pro, then there was more wiggle room, but it's such an overwhelming vote against. And then, again, I think Lycos may have made some they could have been a little bit more diplomatic about the results, although they were in a difficult position. And then we saw the decision that was made. So that's my kind of 100-foot view on the last year.
Yeah. Two things I want to help shed some light on. Do you offhand know what ICER is in terms of who do they work for? From my understanding, they receive their financing from largely insurance companies who are saying do we want this or not? Is that roughly accurate?
I don't know enough about them to say. I have looked, I saw months ago now kind of a breakdown of their financial, where they receive support from. I want to say that it was, there is funding from that source, but I don't believe it is as substantial as people believe it to be. That's my
That's interesting. Okay.
Quick at a glance. I don't, I wish with everything I said, I wish I had a little kind of number above my head that was a 1 to 10 scale of confidence that I wouldn't have to say, this for me would be a 3 out of 10 in terms of my confidence level about ICER. Okay. But I think it speaks to, certainly there's always this question around what are individuals or groups' incentives, right? And so this is sort of a suspicion around that. I don't want to weigh into that. I don't. I think look, when I spoke to David Rinn, what he the CMO of ICER, what he said, and I'm very empathetic to this, which is, look, we heard these allegations from various sources. I emphasized David Nichols and Lily Ross, but they weren't the only sources, to be fair. And ICER said, well, what were we supposed to do? Right? Like, do you ignore the allegations? Like, I probably wouldn't, right? So I think ICER was put into a tough spot as well.
Right. Especially when there's no room or financing for them to do their own investigation against these allegations, right? And then, some had been through court and some, I guess, have not yet been through court. I don't know what the other ones are offhand. But yeah, it's a complex scenario. And is that, I don't know, like, from what I understand, Ingmar, the rate of abuse, as far as we understand it, in psychedelic psychotherapy clinical trials, like Pat, we're seeing much lesser rates of abuse than in traditional. And this isn't rates of abuse. This is you might be familiar with this survey that was published a while ago, where it was anonymous self-reporting on like ethical breaches, and like the general consensus is that people are not exactly staying as clear in their professional ethics as they might present to be publicly. And a lot of this stuff around like sexual boundaries or relational boundaries, and the rate is really high in those self-reported anonymous studies. And if you compare that to what we know about the particularly this MAPS Lycos project, it's way lesser than that rate. So I don't know, like, to me, we're doing something really good in PAT, if that's the case.
Well, I mean, as far as the allegations that are in the report, aside from the one case that we are aware of about that happened in MP4, these are allegations against. They're not about abuse. They are about mishandling of data or the influence of clinical investigators on participants, the handling of data. It's it's quite. I mean, quite serious for these allegations to be made, and and the question is, are they substantiated? And I think that one of the concerns that I have is that some of these allegations many of the allegations are coming from people who are not really equipped to evaluate clinical trials, how they're run, the methodologies. And so they can have an experience of something that is valid and true. For example, they experienced suicidal ideation after the study was finished, but say before the long-term follow-up was conducted. This is actually something that one of your previous guests touched on. One of your previous guests implied that, and even maybe outright said that, Lycos didn't count a instance of suicidal ideation because it was outside of the window of when it was documented, and this is part of a problem, right? The problem is that there are explanations for why certain decisions are made, and a participant may have an experience. They might be experiencing suicidal ideation, and then they look at a published paper and they say, why isn't an adverse event noted in that published paper? But what they experienced was real, but maybe it didn't qualify as an adverse event. Maybe it's outside of the study window, right? So it's one thing to, I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is sort of this, a belief about the motivation or the malevolent or these accusations that are being ascribed to quote unquote Lycos, where that's not actually what is going on. And maybe one thing else, we can take a deep dive into this particular piece, but one thing I maybe want to just say here in terms of Lycos also for your audience is that, Lycos has received a lot of critique, and Lycos, it's easy to critique, especially online, a faceless, a quote unquote like for-profit company, but people tend not to be aware that there are individuals within that organization, one, and two, in a clinical trial, Lycos isn't collecting the data. They're not administering surveys. They're not administering the therapy. I was. I and about 100 other licensed mental health professionals were responsible for the data integrity and the clinical care of these participants. And so when somebody goes out there and says, oh, well, Lycos is a cult, or they say, well, they were fudging the data. They didn't really want to respond to this thing, or they didn't care about placebo effect or what have you. It's not a faceless organization. It's not even really Lycos. You're critiquing the integrity of us as therapists, right? For whom compassion, equanimity, right? All of these qualities are so important to us. So when you say that we're a cult member, right, that completely undermines and attacks our integrity as people who are in a caring profession. And two, when you say that there's allegations of fudging data, that cuts us at the knees as scientists. And so people aren't necessarily connecting the dots, right? They think they're critiquing the organization, but they're also impacting us as individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's major because there's so many people in one go. So you can, with, one offhand comment that maybe is designed purely for impact in the short term, you're really burning a lot of bridges and, not really doing your future self a lot of favors, I think. So is this a good point to talk about the therapy cult thing a little more?
Yeah, sure.
What do you, so often, I don't know if this is obvious for everybody, but a lot of the work done to develop the MAPS manual around MDMA-assisted therapy was based on the work of Stan Grof, LSD psychotherapy, holotropic breath work, things like that. One of our mentors, Elizabeth Gibson, was one of the original editors on the first version of it, which I'm proud of. And I think it's an amazing piece of work. But if we're trying to interface with FDA, there's some reasons we might want to do things slightly different. But the fundamental thing, it seems to me, that they were trying to push on was this inner healing intelligence concept. And is it real or not? Or is it just some figment of the imagination? Is it your holy guardian angel? What is it that they're talking about? And why is it that this is pretty clever metaphor, in my opinion, the thing that makes you indoctrinated in a cult? I don't get it. Yeah. I don't understand. Yeah. And I think they're batshit for trying to make that argument.
Yeah. Well, I think, when I think about symposia in constructing this argument, the phrase connecting one too many dots comes to mind. Because, if you read their analysis, which is available online, there's a lot of citations and sources, and you can see it. You can connect the dots and come to this conclusion. I mean, just to respond to a few things you said, yeah, the MAPS therapy manual references, I believe references, and is undoubtedly influenced by Stan Grof's work. But there are also references to internal family systems, to exposure therapy. There are references to many different schools of thought when it comes to trauma treatment. I think that's the most important thing, that it's a trauma-informed treatment. The other thing that seems to get neglected, we can come back to the cult thing, but this is sort of my PSA, which is that everyone's talking about the manual. Nobody is talking about the MAPS adherence manual. And this is something that I was involved in as a graduate student and studied. in brief, you can think of the adherence manual as the recipe for the therapy. The psychotherapy manual is sort of the conceptual piece to it. But the adherence manual is really the it's the ingredients, mix the eggs with the flour, 350 degrees. It's that, but for the psychotherapy. And so the adherence manual is actually designed for an observer, for somebody to watch these video recorded sessions and then code what is happening, like essentially saying yes or no, this particular intervention was done or not. For example, the therapist created a sense of safety and support in the setting, or at some point during the dosing session, the therapist asked about the participant's trauma if the participant did not bring up the trauma at some point during the session already. I'm paraphrasing it, but there are things like this, so that it's observer-based, so that two adherence raters could watch the same video and then have agreement that they saw what they saw. That's referred to as the inter-rater reliability. It's a statistical measure. So I say all of this to say that, you can go in and look at the sort of more prosaic, the prose of the therapy manual and make all sorts of connections, but it's spelled out in very plain language in the adherence manual, and that seems to be neglected. And I think it kind of counters this idea of the MDMA psychotherapy being harmful. As it pertains to the cult notion and the inner healing intelligence, and Joe, I'd love to hear your thoughts of it from your background, but I'll start off by saying the reason why that idea really resonated with me was because of my training in substance use treatment, in substance misuse, where I think things have shifted, but in the last, in the 90s, 2000s, to some degree still today, there was a very patriarchal view of drug treatment, a very confrontational, the disease model and the moral model, although the disease model has some benefits to it. Both of those models essentially say that the person suffering or struggling with substance misuse or addiction is not in control. And not just that they're not in control, but they are sort of so sick that they're kind of blind to understanding even what's happening to them. And this happened, right? There's also denial is a real thing, and I'm not saying that, but that was really the overwhelming narrative. And it was really me being trained by Andrew Tatarsky in integrative harm reduction psychotherapy, and then exposure to the MAPS manual, where the thing that's shared in common is that the patient or participant, it's their autonomy. It's what is inside them that allows them to, in the support of an altered state of consciousness, come into contact with some this is where things get abstract, but in some sense of knowing, internal wisdom, a tendency to move towards healing. And this is old stuff. This is humanistic psychotherapy. This is, these are not new ideas. They've existed in the field of psychotherapy for many, many, many decades. But Symposia's position is that the inner healing intelligence is this kind of spiritual concept that is, I guess, that the participants are indoctrinated into, which, by the way, is not true at all. We've had participants say that they think that the inner healing intelligence is BS, and they're like, okay, great. Like, this is like whatever works for you. This is sort of a very extremely patient-centered approach. But for Symposia, it's sort of a key or a mechanism for kind of like mind control, or they've brought in different theories like facilitated communication to essentially manipulate the participant. And to steelman a little bit, yeah, that could happen if you are a facilitator, therapist, whoever, who wants to manipulate and take advantage of a person. You could do that. There's lots of different ways you could do it, but you could, say, well, I think what your inner healer really is saying is that, you need to move in with me and we need to have a relationship. And that's a little blunt, but things like those kind of undue influences can happen. That's why there's so much training. That's why we pay attention to this particular mechanism. This is why ethics is so important. It's not a reason to get rid of the metaphor. It's not, the misapplication of it is not emblematic of what the therapy is.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'll kind of speak from my perspective. I've been exposed to this since I started reading Groff in 2001, and took it very seriously. And it's been a big part of my holotropic breathwork journey and psychedelic journey. And I like the Michael Meadhofer kind of metaphor. You know, he's in the emergency room doing, you know, emergency surgery on somebody. It's like not necessarily him that's doing the healing. He helps create the scenario in which the human entity can't heal. And, you know, cleaned out all the dirt, so hopefully there's less infection risk, you know, put the tissue on tissue, so hopefully it heals quicker, things like that. And to me, I think of it as just a straight metaphor. It's like, how are we creating a scenario in which a person themselves can heal themselves? Because, you know, it's the idea that a therapist is doing the healing is not accurate. The therapist is facilitating that healing process, hopefully. And that's what's going on in normal psychotherapy and PAT. And how are we making them feel really safe? How are we empowering them with agency?
Correct.
You know, like, to me, the holotropic breathwork frame, it's more about giving people agency as opposed to saying, you need this wizard to give you a pill and tell you the magic things and then you're fixed, right? Like, there's a way in which we could look at contemporary medicine that way and or shamanism that way. And I think we need to be really careful around, like, how far are we going with metaphors? There's people that take it really spiritually. That's fine with me. I don't care. Like, if it helps them, cool. And then if they want to take it metaphorically, also cool. But, you know, we look at other species. For instance, this is the overdone metaphor of the rabbit shaking off the trauma after being scared or hunted. And that's like, what was that method? Like, everybody just shakes the trauma out.
Like Primal Scream, or I don't know
there was another one. Tim Ferriss kind of turned me onto it ages ago, but it, like, tremoring. You're kind of like initiating tremoring to get some of that, like, embodied kind of like potentially future trauma energy, or, you know, if you look at it like Reichian sense, like the stuck energy, like potentially, like, you know, causing problems downstream. So yeah, I look at it as the human organism knows how to heal, but the conditions have to be there to heal. And I think that only goes so far, because I recently had some brain injury, and I know it doesn't go all the way to healing.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the I think, just to amplify something you said, which is a kind of corrective experience, because, and this I'm taking from Chantal, who really emphasized this, and I've seen this with participants in the MDMA trials, where by highlighting the participants' autonomy, you're sort of undoing a lot of what they have been told and experienced. Well, first, trauma itself it involves the experience of being overwhelmed and being sort of your power being taken away from you. And two, the medical system, the psychiatric system, often places the blame on the patient for not, or the patient internalizes in that way. I didn't do this therapy right, or, you know, the particularly people with trauma have a tendency to internalize that kind of sense of blame. So it's sort of an antidote to that, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, how are we making these people feel more powerful and feel like they have more agency? Like, you think of the veteran with PTSD with, like, you know, a X number of children that make it, you know, even more difficult to get through your day. You know, yes, you love them, but you're just overwhelmed. And, you know, a lot of this trauma that you brought in from your military experience is making it difficult to do what you think your job is now. And yeah, it's disempowerment. It's you're not feeling as functional as you once were. There's so many things here that can get sorted out. And yeah, one thing that drove me crazy, Ingmar, is, like, you know, yes, we have this process that we're supposed to go through, Lycos, for instance, with the FDA for the NDA, and like, totally, like, we need to have those kinds of processes in place. But it didn't seem to me to be looking back at, you know, how much suicide there is in America every single day, like the magnitude of the mental health crisis here and globally. And, for me, I look out 7 to 15 years with climate acceleration. Like, we need this stuff 20 years ago. And like, we're going to kick it down the road a few more years. Like, and it just didn't seem like an intelligent, well thought out decision given the larger, psychiatric status of America or the world.
I think it was very, again, many factors, very complex. I really like what Matthew Baggett said at one point, which is that this is, it's not enough. If we believe ourselves to be right, and I'm cautious around even that position, right? But like, if we believe ourselves to be right, that MDMA is helpful for people with PTSD, then, it's not enough to be right. It's also important to convince people who are doubtful or skeptical. My hope was that the data would speak for itself, but the way that at least the data was presented, how it was discussed, was not enough. I still think that overall the research that Lykos conducted was very, very solid. This does get into some things that we could go back to as it pertains to the. I would like to also come back to Symposia and some of the things that they're planning to do before we wrap up the podcast as sort of yeah, well, they've already done, but there's still there's still a lot more that they're going to do.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. So as a bit of a PSA to your audience, but the raising the question of the FDA decision, a lot has been made of this question about functional unblinding, and this is something also that you discussed with the previous guest.
Can I not tell him on MDMA? Like, get a grip.
Well, it's sort of yeah, and the thing that it's really important to emphasize is that the FDA was aware of this, and this is why the triple blind was used, the blinding of the independent CAPS raters who were evaluating the primary outcome. But again, to steelman a little bit, it's not that I don't think that the FDA AdCom, and I think this was even said in the AdCom, the functional unblinding alone is not the issue. It's when there's functional unblinding, it does make the study and the data more vulnerable to other smaller problems. And it's that collection of smaller issues that this made, it makes this, it's that in combination with the functional unblinding that makes it vulnerable. Now, there's actually a paper right now that is not published yet, and it's under preprint by a number of authors. And what they did is they did a bit of statistical, you could say, analysis, and this is by no means conclusive, but what they did is they looked at the effect sizes of ketamine, of escitalopram, of an SSRI, and MDMA. They looked at the difference between the control group and the group that was studied, the active drug group, and they looked at studies where there was unblinding. And when you looked at the effect sizes, MDMA actually lands somewhere in between the low end of the effect sizes for SSRIs, and ketamine is actually much higher, on the higher end of effect size when it comes to these differences in the unblinding scenario. And what this preprint essentially concludes is that, again, from my understanding, is that, yeah, it's possible that the MDMA studies were vulnerable to the impact of unblinding, but it's certainly by no means conclusive that that was the effect. And it's also important to note that SSRIs and ketamine were similarly unblinded, and those were approved medicines. So again, nothing conclusive. The other thing I wanted to say on the subject, if I may
Please.
continue, which is, like, and this is as much sort of like a social societal comment as it is like concrete about the studies. Someone had said previously that, in reaction to the AdCom, well, the MDMA was the studies, it was all placebo. Like that was the quote. It's all placebo. And so, well, nobody knows that. It could have been all placebo. It could have been, but nobody actually knows the answer to that question. So if you're saying that with that kind of degree of confidence, what it betrays to me is that you don't actually know, and you're you're presenting as if you do. And it's just a more broader societal comment for me, because I think we all do this sometimes. It's not nefarious. We all we want to be right. We want to be smart. We want people to take us seriously. I get it. But really be careful, right? Because other people then listen to you and say, "Oh, well, they have a degree. They've written about this a lot. They must be right." And this is how all of this misinformation gets perpetuated. And one of the things that was raised that I also want to debunk a little bit is there was a point raised about the role. They didn't use this word, but the therapeutic alliance. So the argument is, well, one reason why people got better in the MDMA studies that's not due to the MDMA is because when humans interact with patients, when doctors, that relationship, that attention, it makes people feel better. That's true. And in psychotherapy, we have a construct for it, which is the therapeutic alliance that can be measured. And in fact, there's a publication that came out, a peer-reviewed paper that came out in January of 2024, where they did an analysis. So they measured the therapeutic alliance, specifically in the studies of MDMA for PTSD, and they found that it explained about 20 odd some percent of the outcome of the variance. What that means is that, the human contact played a role in the outcome, but it's not 100% of the outcome. Something else is going on. So it's sort of, again, just to maybe wrap up here on this topic, please look at the data, see if somebody's published on this. And I think it's important to just qualify a little bit of what we say.
Yeah, I'm going to be in person with some of them in less than a month from our recording date here on September 11th. And, I'm a little nervous about it, but we'll see. I'm curious to see, how, I don't really understand how you can beat something to death further than they already have. And that's did you not win? The idea that a small group of people are going to fix all the ills of capitalism through being avengers inside psychedelia seems cartoonish to me.
And the fact that it is cartoonish, and I think the thing that's been most tragic from my view is how the media has really, the media, that unto itself is like a whole construct, right? But that in very legitimate journalism, people have picked up some of this narrative because, there are allegations of people being harmed. People were harmed. There's issues for sure. But it has blown up to such a degree that it's out of control. And I would really hope that journalists would do a little bit more work investigating some of the claims that are being made. And also that other institutions like academic journals or other regulatory bodies would, I don't know, I don't really even know what to say. Perhaps just give a little bit more care as to what they're promoting, or they're not necessarily promoting it, but just there's a lot of I think unfair critique that's going around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And I hope people can start treating this. On one hand, the FDA is not political. On the other hand, the FDA has to respond to political realities, right? So that's part of what happened there. Amanda Hawley, the FDA regulator, who I linked you to earlier, she was really clear that FDA is really insulated from left-right politics. They're very science-forward, especially in this, psychedelic group, and things got inserted into the science that were more political than scientific, and that kind of made the decision more difficult. I like your point though. This is a very multifactorial thing, just like everything in our lives. It's what was the cause of World War I? Oh, sure, yeah, that one thing, totally. But it's 500 things or more, and Yeah, and this is also in some of the circles I live in, Ingmar. We're discussing this as being a challenge to conventional paradigms too. Like this is a new paradigm of healing that hasn't been seen in the FDA before, and that also has to be a big challenge. This idea that we can actually cure psychiatric situations to some degree or another. Like I actually
Mm.
love using the cure word, but it's like,
Mm.
because it's challenging, I use it. Because, in what way does SSRI like cure depression or whatever it is? Like some people see an effect, but like cure isn't really part of it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think it's recognized within the field of psychiatry and clinical psychology that many medications like suppress symptoms, and
sure.
I don't think that that's like well, that's a form of help, right?
Yeah.
Many people benefit from it, and also, I don't think it's really a controversial thing to say. Like that is what they do. I think there's consensus around that. You're touching upon something that's sort of interesting. That you might have heard Matt Baggett speak about this question around durability. This is coming back to the clinical trials with MDMA. That what we might be hearing from the FDA is something like that they're questioning the durability of the outcomes of the MDMA phase 3 trials. And this is partly due to when the follow-up was conducted. I believe the FDA may be wanting a 12-month follow-up rather than what Lykos did, which, per my recollection, was sort of a variable follow-up. It was 6 months from this is hard to explain. The last participant in the trial, it was at least 6 months, but a participant who completed the same trial maybe like 6 months earlier, their follow-up was 12 months. And so you can have actually quite a range of follow-up period, the minimum being 6 months. And I think, again, this is not published, but I would believe that maybe even 18 months was the longest follow-up period. And so you can do a statistical analysis and sort of look at this and say, okay, well, what is the factor of time in terms of people's symptoms coming back? But the FDA's concern, and this is published in their 2023 guidelines for psychedelic research, is that for chronic diseases, they're looking for at least a 12-month follow-up. And I believe they identified both depression and PTSD as a chronic illness, which is kind of interesting from a lens of diagnosis and sort of etiology, right? PTSD forms around traumatic events, sometimes a single, often multiple traumatic events. And PTSD symptoms often resolve on their own without treatment. And also, not all people who experience trauma experience PTSD. That's another like conversation to be had. Because a
Right.
lot of people experience trauma and think they have PTSD, but PTSD is a very discrete set of symptoms. But it's interesting to hear the FDA, and I guess I'm sure psychiatry and other groups, to think of it as a chronic disease, when perhaps, to your point, Joe, maybe we just haven't really seen as effective treatments that would just stop the PTSD. And therefore it's maybe discrete and not truly chronic.
It's interesting. Yeah. I think, there's room for all of it. Like even just how we're seeing the raw computing power now. I mean, problematic for many reasons, like applied to drug development and understanding receptor site binding, et cetera. Like there's room for so many new drugs in the next 20 years. Like I think I think the FDA is going to really have its hands full because there's going to be so many new drugs coming through, both psychedelics, psychedelic adjacent, and otherwise. I Matt Baggett's company is like producing plenty, and there's plenty of others, right? It's fascinating.
It is. And, we're hopping around a little bit. And there's still, I think, one important thing that I want to make sure that we get back to. But on the notion of new drugs and drug development, from an outsider's perspective, it's the venture capitalists and the money hungry capitalists who are looking to exploit people, and certainly like capitalism deserves critique. I don't think that I don't believe that, but the amount of money that it takes to take a drug from preclinical to clinical studies to phase 2 to phase 3, and the risk is incredible because you're riding on essentially the success of a single molecule. So you can put hundreds of millions of dollars into drug development and it not pan out. And so I think there, you know, you know, I'm going to attempt to create sympathy for venture capitalists. And certainly, you know, again,
It's
like,
ambitious.
right. But just for a bit of a frame switch, just, you know, try to put sort of, you know, you're like a born again baby, a baby that's fresh, who's never experienced the world. You know, it's innovate, like that's a resource. Those finances are resources that are going to support innovation. And yeah, you know, wanting to get 100x, 1000x multiples on your, that's the gamble that is being played. And we can totally critique that fairly, but just to recognize that and the psychedelic industry, like right now, people are not you know, they're not Scrooge McDuck diving into their their piggy banks. Companies are going under, they're getting acquired. I mean, it's you know, we saw this last year, and you know, it's tough. It's really tough.
Mm-hmm. It's yeah, like right now, because of the way, I don't know, science funding, entrepreneurship funding is all operating, like it does have to come through, like real serious innovation has to come through, tragically, this kind of this VC front. And yeah, they want 100x gains, but they're willing to like let 80% fail in order to get that. And what's interesting is there's going to be some fallout IP that's just going to get locked up. I hope we can work our way around that, and keep bringing stuff forward. But we'll see. It's a really tough landscape right now, and I hope that people aren't going to slow down, like trying to really improve the human condition with new molecules here.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, coming back to the people, right? Us clinicians, the staff at Lycos, they're, some of whom have been attacked and are actively being attacked right now. They just got into this to help people. Like, I know it sounds naive. Of course, they wanted to get paid as well, and well, and they're feeling. I know some people are really feeling hurt that this is the intention that they went into this work with, and they're being really viciously attacked for it. And by the, you know, I should also say, look, you and I have mentioned Symposia several times in a very critical light, and I want to make sure that you know, don't harass them. Don't send them, you know, threatening emails. Don't, because they've also, from my understanding, experienced a lot of not just hate, but threats, and that's absolutely not appropriate. So that I want to really make that clear. And I think there's an argument to be made that for people who are acting unethically, things need to be brought to light. But Symposia has not been. I mean, they said I'm a member of a cult, and they they called 100 of my fellow investigators cult members. They're not known for subtlety or nuance.
Yeah. Generally, when people in a scene like this out each other, that's got a pretty particular name, and people can go to jail and or get hurt from that kind of stuff. And is that really the route? I think there's more intelligent ways to go forward. We've also seen there's a radical, you know, fallout. Like, I don't even know who's there anymore. Years ago, two of my friends who were founders left, very quietly, I'll add. And then I heard some of the other names that we've discussed here are also not part of this anymore. And yeah, it's fascinating because nobody's talking about it, even those who have left the organization. So we can infer some things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to make things a little bit more explicit, which is that you know, two former members of Symposia left, David Nichols and Lily Ross, and this is public information. David Nichols shared this on an interview when he was interviewed alongside John Lubecki, and Lily K. Ross has posted a letter, you would say, or a declaration on their mutual website that is making allegations against the remaining members of Symposia for unethical behavior. and it's not known what that unethical behavior is. We don't know how egregious it is, if it's something minor or something major, and I don't want to speculate.
Yeah. Yeah. I could speculate for days, but I choose not to here. So yeah, I just, I hope nobody ends up in prison for any of this stuff. I hope people can keep the faith alive that we are going to get some of these molecules through the FDA in the next year and 3 years. I have no idea how long it's going to take for Lycos to regroup and get back at it, but I am confident that something good will happen there. Like worst case scenario in a lot of people's minds is that Janssen will grab this and go with it. I don't know that that's the worst case scenario. Like the worst case scenario is that we continue to have so much suicide from PTSD that we can't treat.
I think I know that Lycos is still in the I don't want to call it a fight, but they're in the game. I know there are many allies that they have. I think it would be incredibly unfortunate if this potential treatment were lost, because it's just to say briefly, it's different than psilocybin, and I think many psilocybin researchers don't in their trials don't understand the difference. Not that they don't understand the molecules or the effects, but the way that it impacts psychotherapy is very different.
Radically. Yeah.
Radically.
Yeah.
And it would be really unfortunate for the people who are suffering for this to not be available.
Yeah. Agreed. And psilocybin helps. MDMA, I think, is a more optimal solution for our culture right now. But who am I? Guy on the internet, another white guy with a podcast. So, anything else we want to throw in here, Ingmar?
Well, there are always more things that I would like to sort of clarify that I think is important. Well, maybe if I can, one more thing, and I want to be sensitive to the time of our audience and
Sure.
you all. I would really like to say a few words of some of the retracted papers. Joe,
Yeah,
are you aware of the
I
retractions?
saw that activity, and I thought people were making a little bit more of it than needed to be made of it. But what's your read on that scenario?
Yeah. Well, just for the audience members who may not know like what a retraction is or what the significance of it is. So when there's an academic paper that is published, that's a really important event, because the data and the information in that article becomes part of the scientific record. And a retraction is really, I think, quite dramatic, not dramatic, but like it's a very harsh and sometimes necessary tool if they're something highly inappropriate in the paper. A retraction, the journal retracts the paper. It's sort of removed from the scientific record. And there's actually, I can't remember the researcher's name, but there was that actual relatively famous case in our community around the early studies of MDMA, when the researcher used methamphetamine instead of MDMA, and then that paper was retracted because the claims about the harms of MDMA in that research were not accurate, because MDMA wasn't actually studied; it was a different compound. So bringing it up to today, there were 3 papers that were retracted from scientific journals that were from the phase 2 studies that MAPS, then now Lycos, conducted. The issue with these papers and this was put in the retraction notice, the primary issue, there's an issue related to conflict of interest, which I've tried to understand, and I know what conflict of interest is. I don't understand what the conflict is. There might be a legitimate thing there that I just don't get it. But the real sort of primary issue was that the participant who was mistreated and experienced an egregious ethical violation in the context of the MP4 study, that individual's data was included in these 3 papers. And that is a mistake. Like, that shouldn't have happened. Her data should not be part of the scientific record because of what she experienced. The authors, I believe, submitted this information and the packet of data, not entirely thinking. This is my opinion. Not entirely thinking through, as an oversight, and so the authors of these papers reached out to the journals to say that, this data shouldn't have been in there. We want to redo the analysis. If the findings are still true, and in fact, the redoing of the statistical analysis was not just the removal of that one participant, it was a removal of all participants from that site. Let's just for safety say, look, perhaps there were some nefarious things going on with all participants around that site. Let's just remove them. They redid the analysis, and the outcomes were the same. But the journal has the authority to say whether that's enough or not. And there's some more background stuff that is not really clear from the retraction notice, but I want to make clear that the analysis was conducted. And the journal said, well, you didn't tell us that this ethical violation occurred in the study, therefore we're retracting the papers. And again, it's totally within their right, but it just seems really heavy-handed. Like if you wanted to have the best interest of the science and the data, you would say, okay, let's remove this one site, and if the significance is the same, it's still legitimate. The way that I kind of see this is that, well, the journal, this is my opinion, interpretation, the journal must have thought, well, if they didn't come forward with this, then they must not be trustworthy at all, and therefore let's retract the whole thing. Which I think also sums up sort of the current feelings about Lycos just generally. Like in the media and public opinion right now is that this organization is not trustworthy, which I think is, again, comes from a lot of these little, maybe sometimes not so little, but sometimes these issues that have really been compiled and I think blown out of proportion.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the one thing to also say, sorry, is that people, this is what I keep hearing on the internet and reading about. People are saying because the participant experienced this harm, that is why the retraction happened. That is not the case. It's not about that happening. It's about it not being made known in the publication. And the other thing I should say is that there's a journalist who goes by well, I'm not going to name their name, but there's a journalist who, you can search this online. They created a petition essentially to the editor of this journal about a year ago that put forward all sorts of allegations that, they communicated directly with the editor of this journal. And I know this because this journalist posted screenshots of their email communications with the editor on Twitter. And so, well, look, I'm not going to draw any kind of conclusions from that, but there was an effort by an individual for this paper to be retracted.
That's interesting. And I like this idea of her data not being included and that being the reason, but time will tell. Like we'll know more soon, I think, and it'll be more clear. And yeah, this is a really complex landscape, and people are trying to make it seem very simple, and it's anything but simple. This is the first time that a nonprofit's ever made it this far, in history. So, let's applaud that at the very least, and let's just keep trying to go and help more people.
Agreed.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I really appreciate all the insight, Ingmar. It's awesome. I really, I learned a bunch. I hope everybody else did. And I hope we can do this more regularly. It's crazy we haven't had you on in such a long time.
Yeah. Happy to be here. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I do hope that people are, moderation. That's my mantra right now. Understand the complexity. Please be skeptical of very simple explanations and stories. And I also hope that you all were able to take away something from today.
All right. Thanks so much, Ingmar, and looking forward to more.
Thank you, Joe.